My orders were very clear. Go out and hunt for them, the drug lords. Arrest them if it's still possible. But if they are confronted with the violence that would place your life, the policeman or the security officer in danger, so be killed.
Now, the United States had a war on drugs. We called it a war on drugs. Now, the United States had a war on drugs. We called it a war on drugs. In the Philippines, President Duterte, he views it as a war, but it was literally breaking down the culture and the society of the Philippines, and so the people of the Philippines elected President Duterte by a tremendous margin, and they wanted law and order, and he gave it to them.
Do not corrupt them with drugs. Do not destroy their minds. And I said, because I will kill you. And I've been very clear with that. Do not destroy my country. Do not destroy our young people. Because if you do that, I will kill you.
Greetings. This is Mike Billington doing an interview with Senator Richard Black for the LaRouchePAC video show. Senator Black is not only a state senator in the state of Virginia, but he's a retired colonel from the Army and served, and it'll be important for this interview, he served as the chief of the criminal law division for the Army at the Pentagon, at the JAG office in the Pentagon for several years in the 1990s. So he's quite familiar with the questions of law enforcement as well as military issues. He also served in Asia during the Vietnam War and spent time in the Philippines, where he made many friends and still maintains some of those friendships. What I want to discuss today is the war on drugs being launched by the newly elected President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. He pledged during his election campaign that he would crush this massive drug trade and the drug addiction of 3 to 4 million of his citizens within 6 months. He's not sure he can make that schedule. But he has in fact launched a full-scale war on drugs since his inauguration on June 30th, has already been very effective. But as you know, and as most Americans know, all you read about in the US press and you hear from President Obama is that he has carried out atrocious human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, that somewhere around 2,000 drug dealers have been killed by the Army and the police who have carried out this serious war on drugs. So I know you have strong views on this, and I'd like you to discuss what you think about what a war on drugs is and what's going on there in the Philippines.
Well, it's really a very fascinating situation. President Duterte was formerly the mayor of a once lawless city, Davao City, and he was absolutely ruthless with criminal actors there, and he brought law and order to the city. I happen to have a very dear friend from Davao City, and I asked him, I said, what's your thought of President Duterte? He said, I love him. He said, he's great. And this is a fellow who spent his career in the U.S. Army, but he's Filipino by birth. And so, you know, I think to some extent, I kind of understand people's concerns. Duterte said, look, we're going to kill the drug dealers. If you're dealing drugs, we're going to kill you. If you're taking drugs, you better turn yourself in. We're going to rehabilitate you, but you're not going to be out on the streets taking drugs. We're treating this like a war. Now, the United States had a war on drugs. We called it a war on drugs, but it was very quickly undermined by border state politicians who worked very hard to make sure that the Mexican border was open as a transit point for drugs, and now it's just wide open. I mean, we're we're bringing heroin and marijuana and cocaine. Everything under the sun is coming across in massive loads. In the Philippines, President Duterte, he views it as a war, not as a police action. And I think that's the difference. Is we always viewed ours as a police action. It was like addressing any type of crime. But it was literally breaking down the culture and the society of the Philippines. And so the people of the Philippines elected President Duterte by a tremendous margin. And they wanted law and order, and he gave it to them. Now, they're 4 months into the war on drugs, and estimates are somewhere around 2,500 drug dealers have died in the process. But he announced just the other day, I think yesterday, that there are very few drugs on the street, and I take him at his word. I think he's right and honest about that. One thing that we need to understand: every country and every culture is different. The Philippines is it's a nation of 7,000 islands, and it is difficult to govern those islands because you have these separations, and consequently, to rule the Philippines, you have to rule with a very firm hand, and that is what the Philippine people have chosen, is to have a very strong ruler. And I think he is well along the way to winning the war on drugs, and I think that there will be a time when he sort of begins to treat it as a police matter rather than a military matter. But I think it is wise for Americans to recognize these differences in culture and to say, okay, Filipinos who elected this government have a better feel for their country than we do sipping our cocktail glasses back in the United States.
I took the time to look up how many overdose drug deaths there are now in the United States. And the figure is around 38,000 per year. 38,000 per year. That's more than 100 every day, people dying from drug overdoses in a country which, as you said, has basically opened its borders, a president who has adamantly refused, in fact ruled, that no banker caught laundering drug money shall go to jail, so that the biggest drug dealers, the bankers running the drug economy, are go scot-free. And of course a president who is legalizing drugs, who's pursuing the idea of legalizing drugs in the United States.
Well, he's refused to enforce the prohibition on marijuana, which, whatever you think of it, it is the law. And yet he has simply ignored it, and so all across the nation you have states that are enacting legalization laws without, I think, understanding the consequences. I don't think it's an accident that the federal government has projected this notion that we just really don't care about drugs anymore, and as a consequence, in Virginia, in states all around the country, we have this massive epidemic of heroin. I suspect that the vast bulk of those folks started with a marijuana cigarette and took some cocaine, and then the next thing they're on heroin. And
even the other side of that, which is people who start with opioids for painkillers and then find it's cheaper to get cheap heroin on the street these days. But we've recently learned through public exposés that the government has refused to prosecute the pharmaceutical companies who acknowledge that somewhere near half of their produced opioids are in fact not going into medical circles, but are somehow leaking out onto the street.
Yeah, and, they've created this myth that somehow the prisons are full of people who were caught with a marijuana cigarette. And I will tell you, you know, as a former chief of the Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, that users don't go to prison. They don't. What you have is major dealers who go to prison, and often the reason that a dealer is in prison is because he was investigated for having 2 pounds of marijuana and suspected strongly of having murdered somebody else, and they plea deal it, and so he's in there ostensibly for drugs, but in fact for things that are much more serious.